The air was thick with the scent of ancient earth, and the rhythmic clang of pickaxes echoed through the cavernous excavation site. Dim floodlights cast long, flickering shadows on the weathered stone walls, which bore the marks of time and something more. Intricate carvings depicting strange, elongated figures with large eyes and elongated limbs. At the heart of it all stood Dr. Elias Hart, a renowned archaeologist whose obsession with Mesopotamian history had brought him to this uncharted corner of the desert. His fingers traced the carvings, feeling the grooves of each figure's outline, as if the stone itself held secrets it was desperate to share. The figures bore an uncanny resemblance to something unearthly. Not humans, not animals, something else. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced back at his assistant, Miriam, who was busy cataloging artifacts on a portable workstation. "Do you see this, Miriam?" Elias called out, his voice barely concealing the tremor of excitement. "Look at the eyes, the proportions. These aren't human depictions. They never were." Miriam glanced up, her brow furrowed with skepticism. "Another ancient alien theory, Dr. Hart?" she teased with a half smile. "We've been through this before." But Elias wasn't laughing. His gaze was fixed on the wall, unblinking. "No, this is different," he muttered. "This isn't speculation. This is documentation." At that moment, the excavation team's radios crackled. Static buzzed through the air before the voice of a worker came through, breathless and urgent. "Dr. Hart, we found something. You're going to want to see this." He exchanged a glance with Miriam, eyes wide with the silent understanding that something monumental had just shifted. They both sprinted through the narrow corridors of the dig site, ducking under low-hanging beams and dodging clusters of equipment. When they arrived, a small crowd of workers had already gathered around a large stone sarcophagus, its surface covered in the same eerie carvings as the walls. It had been unearthed from beneath an ancient stone slab, one that hadn't seen the light of day for thousands of years. The workers had stopped prying it open and instead stood in stunned silence, their eyes locked on the strange, shimmering residue coating the sarcophagus's edges. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't rock. It was something else entirely. "Don't just stand there," Elias ordered, regaining his composure. "Help me open it." Miriam hesitated, a sense of foreboding washing over her. "Are you sure, Dr. Hart? We don't know what's inside. It could be dangerous." "Dangerous or not, this is the find of a lifetime," he replied, gripping the edge of the stone lid. "Help me." With a collective effort, the team heaved the heavy stone slab aside. The ancient air inside escaped with a hiss, carrying with it an otherworldly metallic tang that made Elias gag. But it wasn't the smell that shocked him. It was what lay inside. The figure within was unlike any human remains he had ever seen. Its body was elongated, the arms unnervingly long, and its head was bulbous with large hollow eye sockets. The skin, or what remained of it, had a shimmering iridescent sheen, like polished metal fused with organic tissue. "Dear God," Miriam whispered, her hand covering her mouth. That's not human." The others stepped back, their faces pale with disbelief. One of the workers muttered a prayer under his breath, his eyes locked on the strange figure inside the coffin. Elias knelt closer, his scientific mind battling the growing sense of dread clawing at his chest. He pulled out his tablet, using the camera to capture every angle, every detail of the body. It's too well preserved, no decomposition, no sign of human mummification practices. His fingers hovered over the shimmering surface of the being's arm, hesitant yet compelled. "Don't touch it," Miriam snapped, her voice sharp as a knife. "You don't know what it could be carrying. Bacteria? Pathogens?" "It's dead, Miriam," he said with a shaky laugh that held no humor. "Whatever it had, it died with it." But as he spoke, the shimmer on the being's skin flickered, like sunlight reflecting off the surface of water. Elias stumbled back, eyes wide with terror. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Miriam asked, already backing away. "The light, its skin just—" He stopped himself, rubbing his eyes. It had to be a trick of the light. Too many hours spent underground. "Never mind," he muttered. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. That night, Elias sat alone in the team's research tent, reviewing footage of the day's discovery. Frame by frame, he watched the moment he captured the being on camera. His finger hovered over the screen. There, right there. A flicker, a glow. It wasn't his imagination. His pulse quickened as he rewound the footage and played it again. The shimmer on the being's arm moved, not in response to light, but of its own accord. It pulsed, like a heartbeat. Elias's mind raced with questions, none of which had comfortable answers. Self-repairing material? He muttered to himself. No, that's impossible. He leaned in closer, pausing the frame on the glow. Unless... His breath caught in his throat. Miriam entered the tent, holding 2 cups of coffee. She set one down next to him, noticing his wide-eyed expression. "What's wrong, Dr. Hart?" He didn't answer. His eyes were glued to the screen, his mind already 1,000 miles away. "I think it's alive," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. Miriam froze. "Excuse me?" He pointed to the paused frame on the tablet. "That shimmer? Look at it. Organic compounds can't do that. It's not a reflection, it's movement." She leaned in, her face inches from the screen, eyes narrowing. "If that's movement, then what does that mean, doctor?" He slowly met her gaze, his face a mask of fear and wonder. "It means it's not dead, and it means it's aware." The sound of metal clanging echoed from outside the tent, followed by distant shouting. Both of them turned toward the entrance. The shouting grew louder, frantic. Elias and Miriam rushed out, their hearts racing. "What's going on?" Elias shouted, scanning the area. One of the workers ran up to them, his face pale as death. "It's moving, doctor," he stammered, pointing toward the excavation site. "The sarcophagus, it's moving on its own." Elias's heart pounded in his chest. No, that's not possible," he muttered, already running toward the dig site. By the time he arrived, the scene was chaos. Workers stood at a distance, shouting warnings, pointing at the stone coffin that now lay on its side, its lid completely dislodged. No one had touched it, but something had come out. The tracks in the dirt were unmistakable. Long clawed prints leading away from the sarcophagus. Deep, deliberate steps, each one dragging behind it a thin line as if something heavy was being pulled along. "Where is it?" Miriam whispered, her eyes darting around the site. No one answered. The workers exchanged terrified glances, whispering to one another in hushed, frantic voices. No one had seen where it went. A sudden burst of static blared through Elias's walkie-talkie, followed by a single breathless word from the other end. "Run." Then silence. Elias's eyes locked with Miriam's for a single, terrifying second. No one needed to say it. They knew. Whatever had been buried beneath the ancient Mesopotamian sands for thousands of years was no longer buried. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a low, guttural sound echoed from the darkness beyond the site's floodlights. It wasn't a sound any human had ever made. It wasn't a sound any human should ever hear. "Back to the tents!" Elias yelled, grabbing Miriam's arm. But it was too late. From the shadows, 2 glowing, almond-shaped eyes flickered to life, watching them with an intelligence far older than any of them could comprehend. The alien gods had returned, and they were no longer content to be worshipped from afar. The camp was gripped by a suffocating silence, broken only by the distant hum of the excavation site's floodlights. Everyone's breathing was shallow, their eyes darting toward every shadow that shifted in the desert wind. Dr. Elias Hart could feel the weight of dread pressing down on his chest as he and Miriam huddled near the central tent. Every rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible. This was not happening. And yet, the evidence was right there in the dirt. Deep, clawed footprints leading away from the unearthed sarcophagus. "Stay close," he whispered to Miriam, his eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the floodlights. "Close to what, Elias?" Miriam's voice was sharp with barely concealed panic. "That thing isn't following any rules. It's not an animal. It's not human. It's..." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Don't lose your head," Elias replied, his tone firm but strained. He scanned the shadows, fingers twitching as he gripped a flashlight with white-knuckled intensity. "We've dealt with wild animals before. Same tactics, calm movements, stay together, don't provoke it." Miriam shot him a glance, incredulous. You think this is a lion, Elias? You think this is some wild jackal? She gestured wildly at the tracks leading away from the sarcophagus. Look at those prints. It walks on 2 legs. It drags something. That something could be one of us next. Before Elias could respond, a scream pierced the night. It wasn't a cry of pain, but a raw, primal terror that echoed through the camp like a lightning strike. Every head snapped toward the source, the far edge of the excavation site near the tool shed. One of the workers, a young man named Farid, sprinted out from behind the shed, waving his arms wildly. "It's here! It's here!" he bellowed, his voice hoarse and cracking with fear. All eyes turned toward the darkness behind him. It was faint at first, like a blur just beyond the edge of perception. Then it moved, smooth, fluid, and impossibly fast. "Run!" Elias yelled, his voice breaking with urgency. The workers scattered in every direction. Some ran toward the central tent, others toward the excavation vehicles, and a few simply bolted into the desert with no plan at all. But Elias didn't run. He froze. His eyes locked onto the figure emerging from the darkness. It stepped into the floodlight's glow for the first time, and every muscle in his body tensed with primal fear. It was tall, easily 8 feet. Its skin shimmered like liquid silver, the iridescent sheen shifting colors like oil on water. Its eyes, large and almond-shaped, were black as obsidian with faint golden rings pulsating at their centers. Long, sinewy arms hung at its sides, each finger ending in a sharp, curved talon. It moved with eerie grace, its head tilting slowly as it observed the chaos it had caused. Elias's breath hitched in his throat. It wasn't a wild animal. It wasn't even close. It was studying them. "Back to the tents!" Elias hissed, grabbing Miriam's sleeve and pulling her with him. She resisted for a split second, her eyes glued to the creature, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "Elias," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "It's looking at us." "Move!" he barked, yanking her with all his strength. The sudden jolt snapped her out of her stupor, and they sprinted together, their boots kicking up plumes of dust. Behind them, the sound of something heavy landing on the ground echoed like a thunderclap. Elias glanced back. Just once. The creature wasn't walking anymore. It was running. "Don't look back!" he shouted, pulling Miriam ahead. The pounding of footsteps grew louder, each impact rattling the ground beneath them. Elias's heart felt like it would explode. His lungs burned with each breath, but he didn't stop. They reached the tent and dove inside, collapsing onto the ground as they zipped the entrance flap shut. "Lights off!" Elias gasped, reaching for the lantern hanging overhead. His fingers fumbled at the switch. Click. The light vanished, plunging them into suffocating darkness. They sat there, back to back, chests heaving, ears straining for any sound outside the tent. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. One step, then another. And another. It was outside. "Don't breathe," Miriam mouthed silently, her eyes wide with terror. The crunching footsteps stopped directly in front of the tent. Elias clamped a hand over his mouth to stifle his breath. They could hear it now. It's breathing. Slow, steady, and mechanical, like air being sucked in and out of a hollow tube. It was rhythmic, deliberate, intelligent. Then something tapped the canvas wall of the tent. Tap, 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 like fingers drumming on a table. Miriam's eyes met Elias's. Her pupils were pinpricks of panic, and he knew exactly what she was thinking. It was toying with them. It knew they were inside. The tapping stopped. The breathing did not. Silence. Time stretched unbearably. 10 seconds? 20? A full minute? Then they heard it move again. The crunch of gravel underfoot. The slow, deliberate steps faded, one by one, into the distance. "Is it gone?" Miriam whispered, her voice so quiet it was barely sound. "I don't know," Elias replied, his breath shallow. "It could be circling back." They sat there, unmoving, listening to the night. No footsteps, no breathing. Just the low hum of the floodlights and the distant call of a desert owl. Then the radio crackled to life. "Elias?" It was Farid's voice, static-laced but clear. "Elias, are you there? Please respond." Miriam reached for the radio, but Elias grabbed her wrist. He shook his head, eyes wild. "No," he mouthed. "It's a trap." Her eyes darted between his face and the radio. "But it's Farid," she mouthed back. But something was wrong. Elias's instincts screamed at him. The voice was off. Not just the tone, it was the rhythm. The way it lingered on certain syllables, the slight delay between words, as if the voice was unfamiliar with human speech. "Please respond," the voice repeated, more insistent this time. I'm hurt. I need help." Her eyes met Elias's. She knew it now, too. "It's not him," Elias mouthed, his face pale as death. Tap, tap, tap. Both of them jolted. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was louder, closer. Elias's hand gripped a nearby metal pry bar. His eyes darted around the tent for any sign of an escape route, but there was none. They were trapped. He gripped the tool tighter, his knuckles white. "On my signal," he whispered, his eyes locked on Miriam's. "We run." "Where?" she whispered back, her voice trembling. "Anywhere but here." The tapping stopped. Then, the entire wall of the tent caved inward as something heavy pressed against it. The canvas strained, the outline of a clawed hand pushing through the fabric like a knife through paper. Elias didn't wait for a signal. He grabbed Miriam by the arm and yanked her to her feet. "Go!" he bellowed. They crashed through the back of the tent, ripping the fabric as they fled into the night. They didn't stop, didn't look back. The only sound was the pounding of their feet and their ragged breaths. Behind them, a metallic screech echoed through the desert. A hunting cry. It was chasing them. "Get to the rover!" Elias yelled, pointing to the silhouette of the vehicle ahead. Miriam didn't need to be told twice. Her legs pumped like pistons, her eyes locked on the rover. She could hear the heavy, thudding strides of the creature growing closer. Her fingers brushed the door handle just as Elias shoved her inside. He jumped in after her, slamming the lock. The creature's face appeared at the window, those black, unblinking eyes meeting theirs. It tilted its head slowly, watching them with quiet, predatory patience. Then it raised one long, clawed finger and drew a symbol on the window, a symbol Elias had seen before. The same one carved into the wall of the excavation site. The symbol of a god. Their god. The rover's cabin was filled with the sharp, metallic scent of sweat and adrenaline. Elias's heart was still pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His eyes stayed locked on the window where the symbol remained etched into the glass, a series of interlocking spirals and jagged lines that glowed faintly with a dull blue hue. What does it want?" Miriam's voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. She sat hunched in the passenger seat, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes wide with shock. Her gaze flickered between Elias and the strange mark on the glass. "It's not just chasing us," Elias muttered, his breath still labored. "It's sending a message." He wiped his face with his sleeve, smearing dust and sweat into his beard. His mind raced with possibilities, trying to piece together the meaning of it all. That symbol, I've seen it before. On the walls of the temple chamber, it wasn't just decoration, it was an invitation. An invitation? Miriam's face twisted with disbelief. "Are you hearing yourself, Elias? That thing just chased us like we're prey. It's not inviting us to tea." "That's what makes it worse," he muttered, his eyes still locked on the glowing mark. "It's not hunting us for food. It's testing us. It's seeing if we understand." The rover shook violently. "Hold on!" Elias grabbed the steering wheel as the vehicle lurched to the side. Something had struck it, hard. The impact sent them tilting at an angle as the rover's suspension groaned in protest. Elias slammed his foot on the brakes, forcing it to a screeching halt. Dust and sand swirled around them in a blinding storm. "What was that?" Miriam shouted, her hands braced against the dashboard. "Stay in the rover!" Elias hissed, scanning the rearview mirror. He could see faint shapes moving in the haze of dust, flickers of motion that seemed too fast to track. He could feel it. Something was circling them. A heavy thud echoed on the roof. Miriam screamed, her eyes darting up. The metal above them groaned under the weight of something heavy. Elias grabbed a wrench from the toolbox behind his seat, his hands trembling. "Don't move. Don't breathe," he whispered, his eyes locked on the ceiling. Slow, deliberate taps echoed from above. Tap, tap, tap. The same rhythm, the same pattern. Miriam squeezed her eyes shut, her breath shallow and rapid. Her fingers dug into her knees as if she could anchor herself in place. The tapping stopped. A low, resonating hum filled the cabin. It was a frequency so deep it vibrated in their chests, making their bones ache. The lights on the dashboard flickered, then died. The hum grew louder, more intense, until it felt like their skulls would crack. Miriam gasped, clutching her ears in agony. Elias winced, gritting his teeth against the pain. "It's communicating," he groaned, forcing himself to stay alert. The frequency wasn't just noise, it was a signal, a pattern. "Miriam, it's not random, it's language." "Language?" she spat, barely able to keep her voice steady. Her eyes were red with tears from the pressure. "I don't care if it's poetry. Make it stop." Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound vanished. Silence. Pure, deafening silence. Elias sat frozen, eyes darting back and forth. No movement, no tapping, no breathing. It was gone. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miriam lowered her hands slowly, panting. "What? What now?" "Exactly," he replied, eyes wide with dread. "I don't hear anything. No wind, no engines, not even the floodlights from the dig site." Miriam's brow furrowed in confusion, and she leaned toward the window. Her breath fogged up the glass as she squinted into the night. "No, no, no, no," she muttered, shaking her head like she was trying to wake herself from a dream. Elias followed her gaze, and his heart nearly stopped. The sky was wrong. The stars were gone, not just dimmed, gone. The entire sky was a solid, unyielding black. No moon, no constellations, no distant glow from the Milky Way, nothing. It was as if someone had erased the universe itself. Miriam's breathing turned shallow and erratic. "Where are the stars, Elias? Where did they go?" I don't know," he stammered, panic rising in his chest. His fingers dug into the steering wheel as if it could somehow anchor him to reality. "It's not possible. It's not possible." A sudden, blinding light erupted from behind them, flooding the rover with a pale blue glow. The light was sharp, cold, and unnatural, cutting through the darkness like a scalpel. Their shadows danced erratically on the walls of the cabin. "Don't turn around," Elias whispered, his voice a trembling plea. Miriam's breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes locked with his, and for a moment neither of them moved. But curiosity is a powerful force. Slowly, painfully slowly, she turned her head just enough to see. Her scream shattered the silence. "No, no, no!" she shrieked, her eyes wide with primal terror. Her body convulsed, as if every muscle in her body had seized at once. She clutched her head, shaking violently. Elias spun around, unable to stop himself. It hovered behind the rover, bathed in the pale blue glow. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a being. It was something in between. A massive, circular structure floating just a few feet above the ground. It pulsated with light like a living heart, veins of glowing blue crisscrossing its surface. Symbols, ancient symbols, rotated slowly around its outer rim. The same spirals and jagged lines that were etched into the glass. In the center of the structure, something was forming. A shape, a figure. It was emerging from the light itself, stepping forward like a shadow becoming real. It wasn't the creature from before. It was taller, more defined. Its face was humanoid, but wrong. Too symmetrical, too perfect, like a mask carved by something that had only studied humans from afar. Its eyes, two glowing orbs of searing white, met Elias's gaze and held it. "Do you see it?" Miriam gasped, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Do you see it, Elias? Tell me you see it." "I see it," he whispered, his eyes filling with tears. "God help me, I see it." The being stepped forward, and with each step, the glow around it intensified. Its presence was overwhelming, like gravity had suddenly tripled. Elias felt himself sink into his seat, his breath shallow. The radio crackled with static. Then slowly, a voice emerged from the noise. It spoke in perfect, clear Mesopotamian cuneiform. Elias understood it. He didn't know how, but he understood every word. "Descendants of clay and breath," it said, its voice as vast as the sky. "We are the architects, the forgotten. We are the proof you seek." Elias's vision blurred. The words burrowed into his mind like needles, sharp and searing with ancient knowledge. His head fell into his hands as he gasped for air. He felt everything at once. Fear, awe, reverence. "They're gods," Miriam whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Elias, it's them. The ones they worshipped. The ones they feared." The figure stepped closer, its eyes never leaving Elias's. "Your world is not yours alone," it said. "It never was." A flash of light consumed the rover. Elias felt his body lift off the seat as gravity vanished. His vision went white, every nerve in his body firing at once. He could hear Miriam scream his name. Then, silence. Absolute, infinite silence. When Elias opened his eyes, he was standing in a vast white expanse. No walls, no floor, no sky, just light. In front of him stood the being, its eyes still locked on his. "You wanted proof," it said, its voice calm and ancient. "Now you have it." Elias's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground. His mind spiraled into oblivion, lost in the weight of what he had seen, what he now knew. The last thing he heard before he blacked out was Miriam's distant, echoing voice. "Elias, are we still on Earth?"